Jack gave an introduction. Usually the reader or lector, they give an introduction and they also read the text. So I don't think I have to go into deep details of what is happening in the story. But I do want to open up with a recent K-drama that I finished watching with Mian. And I think it's called Strangers, if I recall correctly, season 2. And season 1 was really good too. But in both seasons, they ended their show with a rather lengthy monologue by one of the corrupt prosecutors. And if you don't know the story, it's not a love story. It's the portrayal of corruption in Korean legal system, like prosecutors, and also the police, and intermingling of corporation and their money, and how that gets played out in Korean society, which is not a unique situation. I'm sure it's similar around the world. But the way that they end the drama is that one of the main antagonist, he says that your feet are like needles in embroidery, that wherever you walk, you're laying down each a thread, and you're making an image, you're creating a work, so that when you, at the end of the day, at the end of your life, you may not know it at the time of your walking and you're living your life, but as you look back, you will see what you have created. And for him, he created a picture of corruption and life of regret, which he cannot turn back, because as in embroidery, once that needle goes into the canvas and enters into the canvas and is pulled through to the other side and pulled back up again, you can't go back on that unless somebody comes and cuts all the thread and pulls all the strings out and starts new. And I want to ask you, I thought it was such a beautiful and poetic image of how we live our life, and our everyday actions, our everyday choices, and every step that we take is actually making a picture of an imagery, embroidery that is cemented into canvas and cannot be simply just erased with an eraser, or start over by painting, putting a primer over it. No, it has to be ripped or abandoned altogether. So then we are in a bit of a trouble, aren't we? Because we have lived our life. Our feet are like embroidery needles, stitching and making images. So when you look back in your life, what do you think you will find? What images will you have? What snippets of scenes will it record? The scenes and moments in your life that is defining for you. Scenes and moments in your life that defines who you are, and things that you have prioritized and things that you have really dedicated your life into. Today we see Saul's life here in this text, where when he looked back, what he sees is that he has forgotten who he is, that he is an anointed servant of God in form of a king, and that he has been blessed to bless others through his monarchy and through his kingship, because he has forgotten about his identity. And now his life is all about his career. How can I, as Saul, keep my career as a king and be accepted by people and be better than Goliath and be successful as a campaigner of military and be loved and appreciated and approved by others? Saul is a prime example of a person who gets his identity from self-benefiting success and approval of others. And he continues as a warning to all of us that as to what could happen to a person when they decide to prioritize their life around their work and the approval and success that it brings. An ultimate fall of a man who gets his meaning in life, who embroiders his life based on how he presents himself to the world. And this is significant for us as well, because the work is still one of the primary ways that we define ourselves. When you go to a party, I don't know if you still go to parties, or a gathering, let's say, and you're introducing yourself to people that are new to you. You know, one of the first questions that we ask is, hi, what's up, you know, and what do you do? You know, what do you do for a living? And we do define ourselves, even within our society, not by, you know, what do you love, or in what way do you want to live your life in righteousness, and what are truly worthy things in life that you are after. But we simply ask. I mean, it makes sense that we ask something superficial, but we ask, what do you do? And here we too live a life where we can learn a lot from the mistakes and outlook of Saul. So to give a little bit of a background story of Saul here today, is that he is a king, and the Lord has chosen a new king who is after his own heart. Because Saul is no longer after God's heart, but he's after his own approval. Because of that, God has chosen David. And I've mentioned this to you before, but let's just say it again. And the jealousy is aroused in Saul's heart. And in multiple occasions, Saul, out of nowhere, without provocation, he tries to kill David. And David had his best friend in Jonathan. And Jonathan was King Saul's son. But when Jonathan was helping David to try to protect him and try to reason with his father, King Saul, a king looked at him as a fellow conspirator, and he also tried to kill his son with a spear. And as a result of that, David has fled into the wilderness to protect his life. David does not see himself as someone important, for he describes himself as, why are you after me? I'm a dead dog. And if you know, anything about kosher food or Jewish culture, they don't eat dogs like other cultures, and they consider them unclean. And David is saying that I'm not just a dog, but I'm a dead dog, and I'm a flea, and nobody wants a flea for anything. And that's what I am. So why would you be after me? But Saul is after him. He brought 3,000 men with him, elite forces of Israel, to search him out. Now let's look at his life and his actions in this story. How relentlessly he pursues David, although David has done nothing against him. In Saul's heart, he has to kill David to protect his own career, his own approval, and his power, and all the achievement that comes along with it. To dispatch anything and everything that hinders his career, he has decided to forget the friendship and wonderful grace that David has provided for him. That David was there to play music when he went into his psychotic episodes. And when he couldn't control himself, it was David who got him out of that mindset. It was David who rescued him at the valley when he was stuck fighting the Philistines, and David came to his rescue. But all of those things did not matter to him. What mattered to him was status quo, keeping the establishment exactly the same as it is. He wants to stay a king, and he wants to remain in power. And for that, he has to dispatch anything and everyone that gets in the way, even if it is his own son. So Saul, in this way, was an incompetent king. He brought same amount of soldiers when he fought Goliath and his forces, but this time he brought 3,000 men of elite forces and to hunt King David, who he owes favor. Saul was cowardly against Goliath, but he is brave and brazen against one of his own that saved him. His desire for status quo maintaining the establishment, maintaining his lifestyle, came at the cost of squandering the royal resources that was at his disposal. Rather than defending his nation with 3,000 men, he used them to search out one person so that his title, his position will be ensured. And his evil and his bitterness and his hatred did not know when to stop. Rather than defending the borders, he took the best part of his army to kill off one of his own. Saul's heart was hardened. He did not know how to pay favor with grace, but he just knew how to give vengeance to those that loved him. How do you heal and restore a bitter and foolish king such as Saul? What do you need to do? What is it that he needs to know and have done to him? What is the logic and what is the correct answer that will derail him from his foolish ways? Here, as King Saul was looking for David all over the wilderness, checking every caves, Saul came into one of the caves to relieve himself. Sort of a comical moment in this very strange tale. And I haven't gone to Israel myself, but I know from news and reading Bible dictionaries and such that finding a person in the wilderness amongst all the caves is near impossible. And we know this very well for when the Allied forces went into places like Afghanistan to look and sort out the terrorists, Taliban. With all the men and their forces and tanks and technology, they still couldn't find them in the wilderness. It is highly improbable to find anyone in all the caves that is afforded in the wilderness of the Middle East. So when Saul came into that one particular cave that David and his men were hiding, David's men said to David, "The Lord has given Saul into your hands today." There was no other way of interpreting that situation, because they know that hiding in those caves gave them an impregnable fortress. And for Saul to come in by himself and present himself in a vulnerable situation, there's no other way of thinking about this but to think of it as a divine, sovereign gift from God. And it really was God's will that Saul would come into that precise cave. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, and there are 20 barns for you to check, and you are blindfolded, and you are loose, and you have to find that needle in one trial, in one go. That's how improbable it is for Saul to be there. And it was God's will for him to be in that cave. But not for vengeance, not for an assassination, so the will of God to have David become king will be actualized by the hands of David. But it was the will of God for Saul to be there so that Saul would yet again experience God's grace and God's love for him. David sneaks up behind Saul, takes his dagger, not for his back or his throat, but for the corner of his cloak. And David carefully, stealthily cuts a corner off. And as we know how this story ends, David, from safe distance, cries out to Saul and says, "Look, I had an opportunity to kill you, but I didn't. I spared your life so that you know that you are God's anointed." David did not make his decision based upon the circumstances of his life. Saul did. He looked upon the situations of his life, his titles, his entitlement, his palace, if he had one, and he made decisions to kill David because he wanted those things. But David did not make his decisions based on the circumstances of his life, but based on God's heart. He showed Saul that Saul is God's anointed, and that he will not lift his hand against someone that God has chosen. And he saved him, even though he did this to him many times, even though he was pretty certain that Saul would not stop pursuing him. And certainly he does this again and again to kill David. And the way that God transformed Saul's heart, at least in this moment, is for him to experience God's love for him, God's grace for him, and God's forgiveness for him. Now, we have to take this story and apply it to the story of the gospel, of the New Testament gospel story. Saul was incredibly grateful. Saul was grateful for the mercy that was shown to him by King David. And he says, "You are more righteous than I." And this bitter king with a hardened heart, king who is set on, like this king who seems to be unchangeable, at that moment he turned and he cried and wept bitterly in front of all his men. And his heart was contrite, it was broken, it was soft and mellow. For he could have died, but David spared him. In the gospel story, we find that we are similar to Saul, that we want status quo, that we get our identity from our work. And you may not think that, no, I don't get my identity from work, but here's some litmus tests for you to consider. One, how do you use the resources that you get from your work? Do you use it for righteous and manner and humility, or do you use it to glorify your lifestyle, to show to the world how much you have and what you are capable of? Do you sacrifice, and this is a second test, do you sacrifice relationships in your life with people so that your work, your projects may continue to prosper? Do you dispatch your relationship with your family, with your kids, even your own health, and your spirituality, and your relationship with God, so that you may work just a little bit more, so that you may get that one more client or one more thing done before you go to sleep? These are the places that you have to ask yourself to see if you are living a life of Saul or if you're living a life that is pleasing to the Lord. Christ, we are living in many ways anti-God life, where we get our identity, our significance through the things that we can achieve. And we're willing to sacrifice and denigrate the things that are important in life so that we can define ourselves through the achievements of our own doing and our own work. How will God heal and restore our own heart when we are so hardened and we don't want to get off this train? Christ has died upon the cross for us. And this ought to mean something for you and I. If Saul was brokenhearted, that his hardened heart was dashed into pieces when he realized that David risked his life to save his, how much more should our heart be broken when God surrendered the life of his son so that he would save us while we were still in our own expeditions of making names for ourselves. When we could not stop searching for every caves, and where we are using all the resources and people in our lives and forgetting what the true duty of our life is, to love God and to love our neighbors. And we put all those things aside, and we can't help but to go on these expeditions and trips and search parties to define ourselves more and more through our work. God is not saying, muster up your will. These are the 10 steps for you to stop doing that. This is how you can love others and love God and restore the image that I have created you to be. Just like God is lamenting when he sees Saul. Saul, I did not anoint you to become that kind of a king, but I have anointed you to be a blessing, a holy and righteous and godly king. But you have failed. And now I'm not going to help you until you fix yourself. That's not what God is saying. But God has given his son in the state that he finds us in. That we are living the life of Saul, and God is looking upon us and says, I will give you grace to get you out of that expedition, to get you out of that mindset, and to break your heart and restore you as a true human being. I will sacrifice my son. He has given his life for you. And when we look at that, we know that we ought to be grateful and surrender our heart, and we ought to tear up in what God has given to us. I want you to confess before God that when you are in distress and you're stressed about your life, and you see yourself sacrificing your sleep, life, your relationship with God and relationship with other people, and you're just working and you're just stressed about how will I want to define myself through the achievements of my work. I want you to come before God and experience God's love by putting your faith in what Scripture says about God's love for you. That he has given his son to restore your heart and to heal you and get you off of this expedition. So that when you look back into your life, you see what God has created for you, not the image and not the corruption and not distress that you have embroidered for yourself. Here are some of the confessions that you can make as you look back on your life and as you reflect on your life. Am I looking at the confession is, I'm looking in all the wrong places to get my self-worth. God, that's my confession to you. My life is filled with bitter expeditions. I define myself according to the patterns of this world. I live my life for the approval of others. I want to look good. And today, your love for me is not good enough. That your love, which took your son to the cross and he died for me, that love is not good enough for me. That's not enough for me. I want to define myself by killing and dispatching and destroying all the important stuff so that I can define myself. So these are the confessions that you can make as you turn back and look into your life. I want you to remember that God has saved Saul, not because he was a good king, but God saved Saul through David because he loved Saul in his broken and shattered state. If God is willing to save someone like Saul, God is certainly willing to save someone like us and fill our life with things that are significant and eternal and meaningful. God loves you. that your self-worth is not from what you can do for yourself, but what God has done for you. Let us not fall into the temptations of Saul, but confess before the Lord, honestly and openly, of where we have been and all the embroidered images that we see in our life. And surrender yourself, confess your life to Him as you are. Gospel message is that we can give ourselves to God just the way we are. And the love, His love for us will be enough for us. That we're not wavered, that we're not tossed back and forth by the good days and the bad days of our own achievements and our own desires.